On my way into the auditorium a little while ago, Joe Wilson stopped me and reminded me that sermons are supposed to be like Tic Tacs, short and sweet. I don't plan on either. I want to begin with a phrase that was popular a couple of years ago. We still hear it some. One of those things that just goes on and on and won't end. But it's this idea of the struggle being real. That's it right there. That's real. The struggle is real. If you look up the background of this, nobody really knows where it came from, but pretty much everybody agrees that it's kind of irony. It's just sarcasm, and it has to do with the struggle of first world problems. I got a job so I could buy me some video games, but I can't play my video games because now I've got a job. Just really, really bad. The struggle is real. But the fact is, there are some struggles that actually are real. And the study that we began last week and we'll conclude tonight is one of those. It has to do with belief. So it is the case that some struggles actually are real, like this thing here. We talked about this idea of struggling with belief. All of us probably at one point or another have struggled. If we have not, I mentioned last week that I'm more concerned about the person that claims that they've never struggled with belief than I am with the person that is even in the midst of struggling. The latter seems to at least be engaging in some sort of thought process, while the former may just be on autopilot, just accepting things blindly. And certainly God does not expect us to accept things blindly. In the denominational world, there is this idea that faith is like a blind leap in the dark. Listen, the Bible doesn't teach that at all. Biblical faith is not a blind leap in the dark. Biblical faith is founded on evidence. Some would, and we know that the evolutionist does, the atheist oftentimes will say that there is a difference between faith and knowledge, whereas science deals with the realm of knowledge, religion deals with the realm of faith, things that you can't really prove. Listen, that's a wrong definition. Fact is, the Bible uses the terms oftentimes interchangeably. That is, faith and knowledge. So it is the case, though, that sometimes we do struggle with belief, with faith, and so we kind of approach the chapter, Luke chapter 24, with this idea in mind. And so we're going to continue that tonight. We can know. And we see this in Luke 24. What we saw last week, the way that we introduced it, we noticed that, number one, that there was a group that who would be close to Christ, three groups, in fact, that would be close to Christ, and yet at the same time, when it came to the resurrection, when it came to really the crucifixion, the death, and the burial of Jesus, they struggled. They struggled. We find the women that struggled with their faith. We find these two disciples on the road to Emmaus who struggled with this information that they were contemplating regarding the possibility of a resurrection that they had been told about. And then we find the apostles. You remember, they're in hiding, and they're struggling over this. And one of the things that we brought home regarding that is that if those individuals who were eyewitnesses to the miraculous power of Christ and individuals that heard the teaching of Jesus, these people walked with Him and talked with Him. If they struggled when it came to belief, it should be of no great surprise that there will be occasions when we do as well, when we struggle. So there were these groups that struggled. And then in the next place we saw not only these struggling groups, but we read about these encouraging revelations, and we just read about the third one just a moment ago. But you remember that the women at the tomb were told by the angel, He's not here. Why are you seeking the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen. Don't you remember what He told you? And then we find the same thing taking place, but this time it is the concealed Christ talking to those two disciples. He goes back and reflects back on on what was stated in the Old Testament Scriptures. Going all the way back to Moses and the prophets, all of these things, he exposed, he expounded to these disciples what the Bible stated about the resurrection and the necessity that he be crucified and raised again. And so there was this revelation. And then the same revelation, just in a different way, finally the fully revealed Christ to the apostles. Again, that's what we just read. He revealed that this was all a part of God's plan. It was all a part of God's plan. So it is not surprising that we struggle, but we do have God's Word that tells us the truth of the matter regarding what we must believe and also what we can believe. And now what we're going to do, we're going to move on to the third group of threes tonight, and we're going to conclude it with that. And this has to do with the resurrection and the evidence. There are three lines of evidence that the Scriptures, that really Matthew 24, or Luke 24 rather, deals with. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. Let me say this, and think about our young people and others, all of us, when we come in contact with people and we're discussing the validity of the Scriptures and whether or not they are legitimate, whether or not we can trust the Scriptures or trust the biblical record, and this idea of what it says even regarding the resurrection of Christ. We need to have some of these things in mind that we're going to talk about tonight. The fact is, going back to the struggle actually being real, the fact is there are plenty of people in the world who are not satisfied with simply not believing in God or not believing in Jesus or not adhering to Christianity. The world is filled with people that are not really dissatisfied with just leaving those things alone, but they are avid opponents of truth, and including, oftentimes more than anything else, including the resurrection of Jesus. And now why is that the case? Because everything centers on this. Everything centers, as far as the Christian faith, as far as the Bible itself is concerned, everything centers on whether or not Jesus was raised from the dead. If it can be proven at all that He did not, all of this is in vain. The Bible is not trustworthy. It's not from God. God Himself, if He even exists then, is not trustworthy. And we're just wasting our time believing in Him. So this is essential that we pay attention to matters like this. Not just because I'm up here preaching tonight, but rather just the topic at hand and what's available to us. Did the resurrection take place or not? Did it happen or not? Can we know? All right, so let's begin. The first line of evidence is this: the empty tomb. The empty tomb. Let's go ahead and remind ourselves of what takes place here at the beginning of chapter 24. So Luke 24, beginning at verse 1, it says, "Now on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they and certain other women with them came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared. But they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Then they went in and did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And it happened, as they were greatly perplexed about this, that behold, two men stood by them in shining garments. They were afraid, they bowed their faces, and then they were informed, He's not here, He's risen." But it's the empty tomb. This is what they discover. Now again, we can put all of the other accounts together, and we'll at least allude to some of those as we move along tonight, but we find that these women, they go in, they are inspecting the tomb. He's not there. He's not there. And I would quickly remind you that the first thing that comes to their mind, especially Mary Magdalene, we find she assumed that somebody took the body. I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind. What would you believe? I mean, if you go to the cemetery one day and you participate in a funeral, you go back a couple of days later, the body is gone. What happened? I mean, the first logical thing to just contemplate is that somebody's removed the body, right? Listen, this is very important, because what it demonstrates is they weren't expecting a resurrection. They were not expecting a resurrection. They didn't have the body. But somebody did. At least that's what they thought. So the tomb is empty. Here's another thing to consider. Why did the angel roll the stone away? I think sometimes maybe we assume, well, that was so Jesus could get out. Really? I mean, here's one that appears and disappears at will and has the ability, the power to walk through walls. This big rock is not going to get in his way. The angels didn't have to come and unlock the door, break the seal or whatever, roll away the stone so he could come out. The stone was rolled away so these women could look in. The stone was rolled away so the disciples could see that the tomb was empty. That's why it was rolled away. The tomb is empty. Let me give you a few theories, and we'll talk about the absurdity of these theories regarding the empty tomb. What happened to the body? What happened to the body? I'm just going to list a few of them. We won't have time to get into a lot of detail on any of them, but some would say, well, they went to the wrong tomb. We mentioned this last week and maybe even the week before. They went to the wrong tomb. I mean, these women are overwhelmed with grief. They've simply forgotten which tomb was his, and they go to the wrong one. They don't see a body, and so they just assume that he's risen. Again, they didn't assume that, did they? They didn't assume that. But they know where he's buried. Remember that they stood by and they watched the actions of Joseph of Arimathea, who buried the body. They were witnesses to the burial. They knew exactly where the body was. They weren't at the wrong tomb. They knew. They knew. So that theory is absurd. Another theory is that there were grave robbers. Some grave robbers came by and stole the body. Number one, if they were going to steal the body and not the possessions that the dead perhaps had on them, they would not take the time, especially if there is a Roman guard set up, and that means more than one person, but a guard of multiple men, and Pilate's seal on that tomb, on that stone. They're not going to take the time to take off the grave clothes and lay them aside, are they? They're gonna if such a theory had any validity to it whatsoever, they're going to take the body and run. They won't take the time to undress it. All right, so that theory is just silly. Another one is this. This is one of the craziest ones of all, and it is believed by a dominant world religion. The Muslim believes that Jesus swooned on the cross. This is the swoon theory. What in the world is swooning? It means, well, because of the lack of the loss of blood and the exhaustion from the scourging and the beating and everything, and the trauma that went along with crucifixion, he fainted. Jesus just fainted on the cross, and when they took him down, they put him in that tomb, and it was cool, and over the next day or two, the coolness of the tomb allowed his body to heal up a little bit, and he woke up and he escaped. Now, let's talk about just how dumb that is. Here is an individual, again, who has been the victim of scourging, an act of punishment that has been known to kill the victims. And we have descriptions in the Old Testament regarding prophecies and in the New Testament regarding the gospel accounts of what took place with Jesus, how he was struck, how he was beaten. He received lashes on his back. So he's not in good shape by the time he does make it to the cross. In fact, he can't even carry the cross all the way to the site of crucifixion. They have to compel somebody else to carry it the rest of the way, right? He's not able to do it. And then when they put him on the cross, he's only there a few hours, and he's dead. And the soldiers, you remember, pierced his side with the spear to make sure, and water and blood flowed forth. That is evidence of a ruptured heart. He's dead. He is dead. There is no doubt about it. And remember again that these soldiers, these are executioners. They're executioners. They know what they're doing. If they say he's dead, guess what? He's dead. And then beyond that, remember that we have witnesses to the burial. Joseph being the main witness, he's the one that did it. He knows what he did with that body. Jesus is dead. So but then, I mean, just think about the absurdity of this person. What he ends up doing, if that theory is right, is that he revives in the tomb, having just fainted. He revives in the tomb, and then he's able to roll this massive stone out of the way all by himself, a massive stone, and then sneak past the Roman guard, find his disciples who are in hiding, and convince them that he is the risen Christ. You know how he would have looked? What kind of shape he would have been in? That wouldn't have convinced anybody. He would have needed immediate medical attention. So that idea is just, it's absurd. He was dead. So again, what happened to the body? Some have gone so far as to say that the enemies of Jesus stole the body. Now we know that the gospel account gives a different story, but let's say that one for right now. That the enemies stole the body. That makes no sense whatsoever either. Why? Because he was exactly where they wanted him to be. He was dead and buried. And don't you think that if this movement that centered on his being the risen Messiah, the risen Christ, the risen Lord, if that gained any ground, all the enemies had to do was bring out the body. That's all they had to do. All they had to do was show people, here he is. You are all deceived, you're liars, and the cause of Christ would have died at that very moment, along with him. The enemies had no reason to steal the body. So that theory is absurd. And then finally, this idea that the disciples stole the body. Matthew tells us that this was the story that was reported, and it was so because you remember how the events played out. This Roman guard, these men, they rush to the Jewish leaders to tell them what they had witnessed. You know, things about an earthquake and an angel, the stone being rolled away and the body being gone. And then what did the Jewish leaders do? Paid them off. Here's what you're going to do. We're going to give you a bunch of money, and if anybody asks you what happened, you tell them this, that while you slept, his disciples came in, snuck in at night, and stole the body. By the way, if the disciples did steal the body, why didn't the enemies that were making those claims just compel them to bring the body forward? And you notice that. I mean, we have record of the apostles being arrested, the apostles appearing before the Sanhedrin, the same council that had Jesus crucified, and not once do they bring up the supposed stolen body theory of Jesus. I mean, if it were true, all they would have had to say is, get the body, or you're going to be executed. But it's never brought up. But anyway, go back to the Roman guard for just a moment. Remember that these men, if that is what happened, number one, they would have been punished. Possibly to the extent of being executed for falling asleep on the job. A crime punishable potentially by death. But here's the absurd part of this, by the way. If the disciples came in while the guards slept and stole the body, if the guards were sleeping, how did they know that? You see how silly that is? While we were sleeping, the disciples came in and stole. How do you know you were sleeping? If you were asleep, how do you know that he wasn't resurrected? They weren't asleep. I mean, they pass out, but they weren't asleep when that happened. So it's crazy. Listen, the only explanation is that he was raised from the dead. That's it. That is the only option left. No other option exists. The empty tomb is the first line of evidence. Jesus was raised from the dead. Jesus was raised from the dead. Line of evidence number 2. Number 2. There we go. The unique witnesses. The unique witnesses. Here I have in mind specifically the women. These witnesses who were the women. I want us to go back again. We've already alluded to it, but go back again to chapter 23, verse 49. While Jesus was on the cross and as he died, verse 49 says, "But all his acquaintances and the women who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things." They are witnesses, number 1, to his death. They're witnesses to his death. Why are they called in as witnesses now? Because of the Old Testament principle that in order for testimony about a matter, in order for it to be counted as valid, in order for it to be honored, there has to be a multiplicity of witnesses. At least 2 or 3, right? That's the biblical principle. Who are the witnesses? These women are. That's why we have them. These women are the witnesses. You can skip down to verse 55 as well in chapter 23. "And the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after, and they observed the tomb and how his body was laid." So they see him dead on the cross. They see him buried in the tomb. And then as we move into chapter 24, verses 1 through 12, they see that he's no longer there. And they are told by this heavenly being, he is risen. And this is exactly, the angel says, this is exactly what he told you would happen. And then they remembered, right? Let's go back to that for just a minute. Look down, chapter 24, verse 6 and 7. "He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was still in Galilee, saying, 'The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again.' And they remembered his words." They did not remember them until this moment. Now things are starting to make sense. It's still a little fuzzy because they don't see him, but now they at least remember the words. They're starting to put the puzzle together, aren't they? So again, they're witnesses. I also find it interesting. Remember, if we go back, what we did last week, we connected this final chapter of Luke to the first chapter, didn't we? Here's this account that is written to Theophilus. Luke tells us very clearly why he's writing. He wants to make sure that Theophilus his knowledge is certain regarding the events that transpired. And I especially like this idea, if it's the case, that Theophilus was some sort of proconsul, a Roman official, someone who is familiar with legal matters. He's especially going to find this interesting and compelling. There's a multiplicity of witnesses, and some of them are named. Look at verse 10. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. Why would Luke name them? I mean, we don't know these people. because it was written in the first century to a person that could verify the testimony. They could be called into account. It says, go ask. Doesn't Paul do the same thing in 1 Corinthians 15? I mean, he lists names, and then he talks about this great number of people that saw the risen Christ, and he said a great number of whom are still alive, and the implication is, you can go ask them. Over 500 brethren at once saw him, the majority of whom are still alive. Go ask them. I mean, if you are in a court and you are in the midst of this trial or whatever, and a witness is called, and they say, this is what I saw. That's pretty good. One witness says that they saw this, and then the next witness is called. That's pretty good. Now we have two witnesses testifying to the same thing. And then the next thing, a third witness is called. And they verify the same thing. And then a fourth, a fifth. I'm not going to go all the way to 500, but you get the point, right? 500 people at one time saw him. Here we have these unique witnesses in chapter 24, though. These women. Go ask, he says. All right. Then one other point. Line of evidence number 3. Not only do we have the empty tomb and the unique witnesses, we have the naive apostles. The naive apostles. Why would I describe them as being naive? Because they were. Because they were. Remember, they are clueless when it comes to an explanation regarding where Jesus is. In fact, not only are they clueless regarding where he is, where his body is, they are baffled regarding the events of the last few days. Because in their minds, for more than 3 years, they have been convinced that he is the one who is going to come in and restore physical, material Israel back to its glory days, the days of David and Solomon, and throw off Roman bondage. That's the thought that is stuck in their head on repeat, right? As they're following him, that's all they can think about. I mean, they're asking questions. So, when you come in your kingdom, who's going to sit on your right hand? Who's going to sit on your left? I mean, that's what they're concerned about. They think that this thing is going to be a material kingdom. In fact, one of the passages that we looked at last week, when these men could reflect back on it, thinking about the words of Christ, just like the women were prompted to do by the angel, the apostles had the opportunity to know ahead of time, right? I mean, Jesus is very clear. On more than one occasion, he tells them, we're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed over to the Gentiles. I'm going to be scourged. I'm going to be killed. And I'm going to rise again the third day. And you remember on one occasion, I think it may be chapter 18, immediately, it says that they did not understand what he said, and then immediately they start asking about who's going to sit where in the kingdom. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, we understand the psychology there because it wasn't in their minds at all that this was going to play out in any other way. So they just didn't get it. But, I mean, it went from, I'm going to die, to, yeah. But where can I sit in the kingdom? Well, what position am I going to have? I'm going to die. Right, yeah, I heard you, I don't get that, whatever, but what am I going to get? What am I going to get? So the reason that I bring all of that up is to show their state of mind. Those that come along and say that the disciples made up this idea that Jesus was resurrected and they carried on his cause in spite of the fact that he was dead and buried, again, is absurd. That never entered their mind. They did not get that. So they, in their naivety, become evidence for the resurrection. They weren't expecting this. And then one other thing connected with that is we could talk about the drastic change that took place. The contrast between where they were prior to seeing the risen Christ, what they were doing at His arrest, at His trial, at His crucifixion, and now up to the third day. Where are they? They're cowering in a corner. I mean, in their minds, they're probably thinking, we're next. We're next. I mean, we were His followers. They know it. We're next. Why is it that Peter denied the Lord 3 times? He was afraid that he was going to be next. So we go from an individual who is adamantly denying Jesus to one who refuses to deny Christ, even if it means being beaten and executed, by the time we get to Acts chapter 5 and 6 and beyond that. I mean, what changed? In fact, back up just a little bit more. Acts chapter 2. Think about the drastic change in the character of these men. Peter seems to be the spokesperson, but all of the other apostles are standing with him. He stands before this massive crowd, millions of Jews, and there is nothing politically correct about the manner in which he delivers that message. You have taken and by wicked hands have murdered the chosen one of God. What would change a person? What would cause a person from denying Christ to proclaiming it, even if it means his own life? What explains that? The resurrection. The resurrection. So, there are going to come times when we struggle with belief. But if you're not in that fog and in that haze at this moment, please listen closely. When it approaches, when things creep in and doubts arise, when persuasive people bend your ear and begin to cause you to doubt and wonder, go back to this chapter. Go back to the events that are recorded in the Gospels. Evidence is abundant. And we'll sort of leave off where we somewhat started and even left off last week. Why do we have multiple records of His death, burial, and resurrection? And why are we told again and again about the resurrection? Remember that these accounts and allusions to what took place do not stop with the last gospel account, right? I mean, we see it as a repeated theme in the book of Acts. We see it brought up again in Romans and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. It goes all the way to the end. Why? Because God knows that we need to be reminded of that. We need to hear it. We need to read it. This is what it's all about. And He knows, by the fact that He has repeated it like that, He knows that there are going to come times when we begin to doubt and waver and wonder. So if you are thinking clearly tonight, please make a mental note of what we've just talked about. Because the time will come and those doubts arise. Maybe it's the case that you're here tonight and you are wondering. You do have questions and concerns. Listen, I would again emphasize that's not a bad thing. Not necessarily. Why? Because God wants us to question. He wants us to engage. He wants us to wonder. He wants us to dig. And the wonderful thing is, He has provided the answers. He's provided the evidence. It's not about some fluttery feeling in your chest. It's not about whether or not you woke up on the wrong side of the bed or the right side of the bed this morning as to whether or not the Christian faith and the accounts of the Bible are real. There's evidence. That's biblical faith. So if you are struggling, let me give you a couple of options. If when we sing the invitation song in just a moment, that is designed to just kind of set aside a time to encourage individuals that do feel compelled to come forward and confess sins or request prayers or obey the gospel through faith, repentance, confession, and baptism, to have that opportunity. So you can take advantage of that time. It may be the case that you're not really ready to walk the aisle, and let me state that you don't ever really have to walk the aisle. These things can be accomplished at other times and under different circumstances. I mean, if you, after services, want to take one of us aside tonight and say, listen, I need to know a little bit more about that. I have some questions or some concerns. Or if you are in bed tonight and you can't get to sleep, it's 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and you have questions or concerns, call one of our elders. Seriously, I mean, you can call, you can contact any of us, me included. But it's of great importance. Dig, question, seek, and find. So if we can help you tonight at this moment, why don't you come forward while we stand and sing?